I'd like to begin this morning by sharing a story with you. I just literally landed here last night from the beautiful city of New Orleans. And over the weekend, when we weren't presenting or in committee meetings or catching a taxi somewhere, I had the privilege Saturday evening to dine at this restaurant called Buffy with my friend Kristen. And I felt as though I had stepped into a wonderful fairy tale when we entered this restaurant. We were greeted, fussed over, and led to this dining area that, as you can see in the photo, resembled something like the carriage that Cinderella might ride in on her way to the ball. We walked up a couple of steps into this encased area that was this very intimate, wonderful alcove in which we had curtains. If we had wanted to close the curtains to have privacy of our conversation, we could have. We had ambient lighting. We had televisions if we needed some multimedia. We had two servers who were there to cater to our every need. And as we began the dining experience, our servers went over every aspect of the menu, literally telling a story in and of itself about each dish that was on the menu that night. And they changed their menu every 2 weeks. They first enticed us with a story about this delectable macaroni and cheese. And I am the carb queen, and I love cheese, so I was all over that. And we enjoyed that appetizer. They then proceeded to give us a story about each of the main entrees. I chose a wonderful salad in which they very graciously left off the calamari rings because I have food allergies, and agreed without me even asking to take a little bit off the price of this expensive salad so that I could enjoy it without any stress of thinking I was paying for something I wasn't going to eat exactly. So we then were offered a wonderful variety of desserts. We did decline on those, even though they were quite tempting. And the entire evening, as my colleague Kristen and I were discussing all kinds of issues about the future of school librarianship, we really felt ourselves so relaxed and feeling just such pleasure in being in such a wonderful environment in which we felt as though our servers really cared about us. We enjoyed some jokes with them. They were telling us local stories about New Orleans, giving us recommendations of other places to go. And it really was quite the enchanted evening, so to speak. And as I reflect on this experience, there are three qualities of that night at Bush that stand out to me. One was that they established a sense of trustworthiness with us as their patrons, that by telling us the story, by being honest, by agreeing to, again, cut us a little bit of deal in some of the menu items, that we felt that they really cared about our every need. They weren't there to just run us through like a cattle call, but they really wanted us not just to come there to eat, but to have an actual experience that would make us want to come back. But they wanted to establish a relationship with us as their new customers. It also occurred to me that there was a sense of likability, that they didn't just come and tell us, here's the menu, here's your ticket, have a good night, but that they took time to have a conversation with us about what we were going to eat, about what we were doing in New Orleans, you crazy 25,000 librarians that have taken over the city, that we immediately were drawn to them and just so enjoyed those conversations that we had. The other quality that stood out to me in this dining experience was that they really offered not only a fantastic product because the food was just incredible, but they offered this really exceptional service. So much to the point that as we left, Kristen and I immediately agreed that should we come back to New Orleans, and in fact this was an incentive to come back to New Orleans, that we wanted to make it a point to dine at Bush. And as I went on to the ALA after hours event, I was telling everybody about Bush and how fabulous it was, and I wanted to share that wonderful experience that I had with others so that they too can enjoy it and have the opportunity to see what it was all about. In short, that experience that the owners and the employees at Bush created was what Guy Kawasaki would call enchantment. In his book, Enchantment, The Art of Changing Hearts, Minds, and Actions, Guy Kawasaki defines enchantment as sustained voluntary delight that is mutually beneficial. and that this delight causes people to want to have a change of heart, to change a behavior, to establish some type of relationship with you. And when I first began exploring this book about 6 weeks ago, it occurred to me that enchantment really has so many applications for the context of librarianship, particularly as we face challenges of being perceived as relevant in our learning communities, being perceived as relevant by legislators, and as we go about trying to reinvent ourselves to be an entity, to be a change agent that truly will make a difference in the lives of our students. To create enchantment, it's imperative that we really get to know the people that we serve, that we don't just see them on the surface, that we don't just judge them, but that we really take time to find out what their passions are, what are their interests, what do they care about, what's troubling them. We have to take time to listen and to encourage and invite them to be a participant in our library programs. What are their stories that they have to share with us that will help us to establish those three qualities of enchantment, of likability, of trustworthiness, of offering a fantastic product and service that will make them want to come back for more, whether it's our students, whether it's getting our administrators buy-in to support the kinds of initiatives that we want to see in our programs, whether it's getting those collaborative partnerships established and sustained with our teachers. We have to go about creating a sense of enchantment. And at the heart of enchantment, it goes back to the people factor. It goes back to relationships, which ultimately are the cornerstone, I think, of libraries in learning and participation. Guy Kawasaki says that enchantment is what transforms situations and relationships. And as you all sit here this morning, I'm sure you can think of challenges that you face in your own program. You're fighting budget battles. Your principal doesn't understand you. Those teachers just won't come to the library and utilize those resources. The students, you can't get them in to come and read or try those databases. I think if we approach our work from an angle of enchantment, then I think we're going to see that those challenges become points of change and points of innovation. But it requires us to invite and listen to what their stories are. Are we the ones who are telling the story of library, or is it the people that we serve who ultimately will have their handprint on what our program is to be? Ultimately, library, I think, is the story of the human experience. We think of libraries as physical spaces, of books, of technology, but when you boil everything down and you distill it to its very essence, every element of library programs comes back to the human experience. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. So we need to think about how do we honor that, how do we cherish that, how do we privilege that in our programming. It occurs to me in the last few months that libraries are very much like commonplace texts. And if you're familiar with this concept from history, commonplace texts are essentially books in which people would take bits of maps, maybe grainy photographs, maybe bits and pieces of other books that they might paste and glue into this central text. Perhaps they might write their own notes or their side margins, so that this book suddenly became informed by objects and perceptions of other texts or other dialogic voices, other threads. And in thinking about libraries, I think that we should maybe consider that as a metaphor for the work that we do. The library itself, you could think of it as a book, but what stories, what pages, what elements are our teachers, our students, our parents, our community, our administrators adding to that story of library? They cannot help tell that story and rewrite that book unless they are invited to be active participants. Students, teachers, they want to see themselves in that library. They want to find a place where they can discover not only the stories about things they're passionate about already, but that we can help them to self-excavate and discover new passions and talents that perhaps they never even knew existed. Ultimately, we need to think about how do we get them contributing to these conversations for learning through libraries, whether that conversation is happening through readers advisory and collection development like Anita, perhaps through our alternative research projects like Kathy's been doing that are art and visually based, conversations for learning that Shannon's doing with her work with Skype, conversations for learning that are happening all around the world with Gwyneth, with her use of QR codes and her gadget wizardry. There are many points and mediums in which we can engage these conversations and privilege our students' voices. It may be a conversation of learning that extends, again, beyond the classroom, like so many of my peers are doing now. Or in our case, maybe we're teaching students about Creative Commons licensing, and it's not just for creating that Glodster or that voice thread or that presentation Zen slide deck, but maybe they've learned about it like Nolan Williamson did and apply it to their own work. In his case, his photography stream, and as a result, had his work featured in a real-world situation in which he had his photography used as one of the main photographs for the Atlanta Botanical Gardens iPhone app. Talk about real-world learning and enchantment. That's what it's all about, and I think that's what we have to do as libraries. If we're creating enchantment, we're cultivating a love of learning and that we're engaging students. And if we can do that, the boundaries that sometimes seem so fixed, so hard to knock down between the physical classrooms and the library space, between our libraries and our communities and those that we serve, will ultimately vanish, and that the library can become an embedded, seamless part of the classrooms, of our communities, and ultimately embedded in the hearts and the minds of those that we serve. So as we think about how do we distribute the library, I really want us to think about very briefly this morning the 5 conditions of participatory culture set forth by Dr. Henry Jenkins when we're thinking about how do we create these conversations for learning and invite participation. We have to have low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement. Are we teaching our students how to use new Web 2.0 mediums for interacting and transacting with others, for having a say in our society, or for creating their own content? Are we providing an environment that creates strong support for sharing one's creations with others? Are we featuring the work they create in our research pathfinders? Do we have a virtual collection? Are we featuring their work on our library blogs or our library wikis, putting that work front and center? Are we helping our students to become experts side by side with us? I don't know about you, but I don't like being the only expert in the room. When I can teach my students a skill and they can co-teach that side by side with me, such as a group of our sophomores did who had learned Evernote and Digo and suddenly began teaching their 11th grade peers how to use those tools for social bookmarking, that to me is the greatest moment of joy and the ultimate goal that we should have, that they become the co-experts with us in the library. Finally, it's also thinking about members believing that their contributions matter. Again, are we sharing and celebrating their work? Do we celebrate their expertise? Do they see a piece of themselves somewhere in that physical or virtual space that we call library? And do they feel a sense of connectedness, not just with us, but with their peers or with others around the world, such as Shannon's doing with her Skype activities and her students' work with Diane Cordell with Club Click, in which suddenly they are interacting and transacting and feeling they have someone cheering them on in their photography work and encouraging those skills through virtual means. Ultimately, participatory culture, I think, is going to be the catalyst that will transform our library programs. And that when we think about libraries and we think about learning, it is not enough just to capture their minds, but we have to ultimately speak to their hearts for them to feel that sense of enchantment and to build our peeps, our community, our sense of students, again, being side by side with us, and that the library program ultimately is theirs. It is not our library program, but it is theirs. That's how we give them the world and how we open doors for opportunity. So as we think about our theme today, creating the future of libraries, the story's being written now, but we have to make sure that that story doesn't have just us as the only editor, but that we have many contributors with our students and teachers as they leave their handprint, as they help us to, as a community, construct this communal text, this commonplace text known as library. Enchantment is the nectar that will draw them in. Give them the honey, give them the nectar. They want that, but they're waiting for you to provide them that sense of opportunity, participation, and enchantment. In conclusion, I challenge you to think about today, how can you embed yourselves in virtual and physical spaces in your learning communities and the hearts and minds of those that you serve? How can you empower your students and teachers to help tell the story of library and make it their own? How do we go about building engagement through participation? Ultimately, I challenge you to enchant. Thank you.
That was wonderful. You did a